My intro was back in the, I guess, late 1980s. Mountain biking was starting to get pretty popular. I lived in central Connecticut, and it was an amazing spot to be mountain biking. Believe it or not, a lot of people roll their eyes at that, but great single track. First bike I ever had was a Trek Antelope 820, and it was a complete hunk of junk by compared to today's standards. But I love that bike, and that was the gateway for me to really get into the sport. So I've been pursuing cycling in some capacity, whether it was road, mountain bike, cyclocross, since I was probably 10, 12 years old. So that's almost 30 years now. And I always swore off road cycling, said I was never going to be one of those shaved leg roadie guys. And funny enough, eventually that came to fruition. And in terms of my career, I've always been involved in the cycling industry in some capacity, whether it's riding or racing or working with various bicycle companies. And I also have some background in business development and simulation software. So I worked for a consultancy for about 10 years where we did one-to-one consulting with primarily CFD and CAD CAM tools and help them bring products to market. So I think there's some parallels to what INSCYD does in terms of creating a technology that was maybe considered, hey, this isn't something that can be done, and change the paradigm the same way that a lot of CFD tools have done through the years. So there's some interesting connections to what I've done previously. And then more recently with INSCYD, this is a project that was really launched to coaches commercially about 5 years ago, and really on a more global stage in the last 2, 3 years. So something that I'm happy to be a part of and really excited about where hopefully we can grow this thing to. INSCYD as a commercially available product for coaches was launched probably about 3 years ago, and there's been numerous updates since then. But prior to that, it was really exclusive to teams and federations. And this was really any endurance sport. So anything that had a time and distance component. And what we're able to do is capture, whether it be lactate values, gas exchange information from a lab using metabolic cart, or power data, and this coming from the bike. We could take that and disseminate that into a complete physiological or metabolic profile. So our origins go back to really probably the HTC high road days. And that was back in the late 2000s. And the team was using it to really determine what are the attributes of riders and use it as a bit of a tool to assess athletes that might be coming up through the ranks and people that they want to determine, do they have the chops to make it as a pro? And our first commercial client, believe it or not, was this French Swimming Federation. Since swimming is so dependent on the anaerobic piece, they really wanted to determine, can we quantify the anaerobic power? And with VLA max being one of the pieces of the equation that we're able to assess or actually determine, INSCYD was a very powerful tool as they determined to be able to use for their athletes in their preparation for different, whether it be Olympics or world championships. Two athletes that come to mind are Wout van Aert and Matthew van der Poel. And yeah, INSCYD is not the thing that makes those athletes great. You could pull those guys off the couch and they're going to be fast. But what's really important for an athlete like that is they're doing so many different types of events that go from short, really high intensity efforts, whether it's a time trial or cyclocross, to then stage racing, where each day might be 3 to 5 hours, and then the classics, where it could be 6.5 hours, and really need to adapt to the rigors of that. So whether it's the insights that you can get from fueling, so all right, how much carbohydrate do I need to take in on an hour-to-hour basis? How much muscle glycogen can I store? And like you said, Geoff, maybe you want to do some mountain bike racing. So if you're doing some mountain bike racing now, how do you structure that within the overall training to focus on Belgian waffle ride and be able to have this compromise between being competitive now and also competitive at this longer, more steady grind style of an event? And there are ways to do that. There's also ways to get some short-term bumps if you really know what is the underlying physiology there. And there's some things that you can do, whether it's nutritional interventions or just some shorter training blocks to really get that athlete to peak form. So hopefully the theme here is really understanding what the underlying metrics or underlying data is, much like, as I mentioned before, you go to a doctor, you do some lab testing. Now you've got something to build a foundation off of. You got something to be able to come back to and retest against in 2, 3, 4 months time. And also you've got better data to be able to help create a training plan that's very bespoke or very specific to that individual. So our suggestion is you want to test in the environment that you're going to be training and racing in. And maybe you can't mimic the race environment, but you can mimic what you're doing in training. So the example would be an Ironman athlete who's training exclusively indoors and they're on their TT bike and they're out on the sticks. Well, you probably want to test in that environment because that's where you're training and that's when you're racing. You want to know what the data looks like. So that's example one. Example two is maybe a mountain biker and they only ride outdoors and the race is probably won or lost on short, punchier climbs. So you probably want to test them on a climb. And so it's very flexible in terms of where you're going to test, but we want to make it consistent. So if you're doing the test indoors, make sure the entire test is done indoors. If you're breaking up over multiple days, if it's done outdoors, let's keep it on the same terrain. If it's on the flats, if it's on a hill, doesn't matter where you're doing it, but just keep it consistent. And generally speaking, do it where you're going to do your intervals and in the position that you're going to be racing and doing your hard training in. This is my favorite question, hands down. So I'll, if I haven't been on my soapbox already, I guess I'll get up a little bit higher on it and say that the athlete that is time crunched, the athlete that only has 4, 5, 6 hours is going to be the greatest beneficiary of this information because that athlete doesn't have time on their side. So the professional that's training 20, 30, 40 hours a week, they can make up for a lot of training inefficiencies with total volume. The athlete that only has a handful of hours per week, they can't do that. They don't have that luxury. They need to be very specific.